The universe, in its infinite and often cruel sense of humor, chose to orchestrate Karen Sterling's downfall beginning with a barely perceptible tap. It was the sound of cheap plastic meeting expensive pearl-white Lexus paint, a sound no louder than a dropped pen, yet to Karen, it was a gunshot signaling the start of a war. She was second in line at the temporary stop sign where roadwork had snarled the intersection of Poplar and Main, just outside the grand stone entrance to Maple Creek Estates. The sun was a brilliant, unforgiving gold, glinting off the hood of her immaculate RX 350. She had just concluded a very productive morning. 3 violation notices issued, 1 for unapproved wind chimes, 2 for lawn gnomes, and a sternly worded email sent to the community's landscaping company about clover patches near the duck pond. All was right and orderly in her world. Then, the tap, Karen's head, held at a posture-perfect angle, snapped back as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her meticulously applied Crimson Fury lipstick formed a perfect O of outrage. In her rearview mirror, she saw a boy he couldn't have been more than 17 in a rusted-out Honda Civic that looked like it had been salvaged from a landfill. He was pale, his eyes wide with the sort of terror usually reserved for seeing a ghost or a final exam you forgot to study for. This was not an accident. This was a personal affront, an invasion, a chaotic element. Reaching the meticulously curated perimeter of her life, she unbuckled her seatbelt with a vicious click. Before the boy could even put his car in park, Karen was out of her Lexus and marching toward him, her sensibly yet stylish heels clicking an aggressive staccato on the asphalt. "Are you blind?" she projected, her voice honed by years of chairing contentious HOA meetings. It was a voice that could curdle milk and silence dissent, or simply incompetent. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The boy fumbled with his door handle. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. My foot, it just slipped off the brake. I was barely moving, Karen scoffed, gesturing to her bumper as if it were a priceless Ming vase that had just been shattered. There was, upon close inspection, a faint black scuff mark, about the size of a thumbprint. "This is a 2024 Lexus. The paint on this vehicle is a specialized multi-coat pearlescent finish. You don't just buff this out. This requires a complete panel respray by a certified technician. We're talking thousands of dollars." Behind them, horns began to honk. The line of cars was growing. A man in a modest sedan, 2 cars back, a quiet neighbor of hers named Alex Mercer, watched the scene unfold with a sigh. He had seen Karen in action at HOA meetings. This was her public performance piece. The boy, whose name was Leo, looked like he was about to cry. "Thousands, ma'am. My insurance. My parents are going to kill me." "Your parents' disciplinary methods are not my concern," Karen said, pulling out her phone. "My concern is your flagrant disregard for private property. I'm calling the police," and she did. As she spoke to the dispatcher, she embellished, her voice dripping with melodrama. "Yes, I have been struck from behind. A very aggressive driver. No, I don't feel safe. He seems unstable." Leo just stood there, speechless and defeated. By the time the police cruiser arrived 15 minutes later, the traffic was a tangled mess. 2 officers emerged, one older and wearier, the other young and alert. "Okay, folks, what's going on here?" The older officer, Sergeant Miller, asked, his eyes already glazed with the practiced boredom of a man who had seen it all. Before Leo, the officer who was already approaching him, could speak, Karen strode past them, cutting directly in front of the line of questioning. She positioned herself squarely in front of Sergeant Miller, holding her phone up as if it were a holy relic. "Officer, thank you for coming. I am the victim here. Karen Sterling, 121 Blossom Lane, Maple Creek Estates," she stated her address, as if it were a title of nobility. "This young man," she said with a dismissive wave towards Leo, "slammed into the back of my vehicle with excessive force." Sergeant Miller glanced from the microscopic scuff on the Lexus to the crumbling facade of the Honda. He then looked at Karen, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, my partner was about to get his statement, and I am giving you my statement," Karen interrupted, her tone suggesting he was being deliberately obtuse. "I am the president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association. I deal with compliance and incidents on a daily basis. I know the proper procedure." Alex Mercer, still waiting in his car, shook his head. She cut the line to the police. It was such a perfect, distilled Karen moment. It wasn't just about getting her way. It was about demonstrating that the normal rules of social order and politeness didn't apply to her. She was the procedure. The sergeant, to his credit, remained professional. He calmly directed Karen to the side of the road and had his partner take Leo's statement, but the damage was done. Karen had dominated the scene, framed the narrative, and treated the police not as arbiters of the law, but as employees she had summoned to resolve a customer service issue. She got her police report, an exchange of insurance information, and a profound sense of vindication. As she finally drove away, she shot a triumphant glare at Alex. He simply met her gaze, his expression placid, which seemed to annoy her even more. The incident at the intersection was a prelude, an overture to the grand opera of Karen's reign. Her true kingdom was Maple Creek Estates, a sprawling suburb of manicured lawns, identical beige houses, and a list of rules so extensive it had its own table of contents. To Karen, the HOA covenant wasn't a set of guidelines. It was scripture. She was its high priestess, its chief inquisitor, and its most fervent believer. Her husband, Richard, a man who had long ago traded his spine for a quiet life, enabled her obsession. "Whatever makes you happy, dear," was his mantra, usually uttered from behind a golf magazine. Karen's happiness was derived from order, absolute, unyielding, microscopic order. She would cruise the neighborhood in her Lexus, a clipboard resting on the passenger seat, her eyes scanning for infractions, a basketball hoop left out past 7 p.m., a flag flown on a non-designated flagpole, hoses not coiled in a perfect, concentric circle. Each violation was a personal insult, a tear in the fabric of the perfect world she was trying to weave. Her focus, for the past several weeks, had been on Alex Mercer. He was a quiet man, a widower who worked from home in some vaguely defined tech job. He was polite, kept to himself, and his lawn was always immaculate. But he had one glaring, unforgivable flaw: his mailbox. It was a custom-built thing, made of dark, weathered wood with hand-forged iron screws. It was elegant, unique, and utterly non-compliant with Article 4, Section 8b of the Covenant, which explicitly stated that all mailboxes must be the board-approved, black, pedestal-mounted heritage model. Karen had started with a friendly notice, a pastel yellow slip of paper left on his door, a gentle reminder from your HOA. Alex had ignored it. A week later, a second notice arrived, this one on stern, white paper. Second notice of violation. Failure to comply will result in fines. Alex had approached her while she was inspecting the petunias at the community entrance. "Karen," he'd said, his voice calm and reasonable, "about the mailbox. My late wife designed it. Sentimental value. It's well maintained, and frankly, I think it's much more attractive than the standard issue ones." Karen had offered him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was her I-understand, your, feelings, but they, are irrelevant smile. "Alex, I appreciate the sentiment, truly, but the rules are the rules for a reason. They maintain the aesthetic, harmony of our community. If we make an exception for one, we have to make an exception for all. And then what? Anarchy. People painting their houses purple, cars on cinder blocks. It's a slippery slope. From a wooden mailbox to cars on blocks. That seems a bit dramatic, don't you think?" "Vigilance is not drama, Alex. It's a civic duty," she had replied, turning her attention back to the petunias. Conversation over. The fines began. $25 a day. The certified letters started arriving, filled with legalistic jargon and threats of liens against his property. Alex paid them. He paid them without comment, which infuriated Karen more than any argument could have. His quiet defiance was a challenge to her authority. He was refusing to bend, refusing to acknowledge her power. He was treating her threats as a mere inconvenience, a cost of doing business. This passive resistance was a new and unwelcome experience for Karen. She was used to tearful apologies, angry confrontations, or grudging compliance. Alex's silent check-writing rebellion was a different kind of warfare. It was one she couldn't win through sheer force of will. So, she decided to escalate. She called an emergency session of the HOA Architectural Review Committee, which consisted of herself and two other residents, said timid retiree named Carol, who agreed with everything Karen said, and a man named George who was perpetually confused. "The Mercer mailbox situation has reached a critical point," Karen announced, pacing in front of the community center's whiteboard. "His continued non-compliance is a mockery of our authority. It sends a message to the entire community that our covenant is optional." For 3 blissful days, Karen Sterling lived in the warm, satisfying glow of her victory. Every time she drove past Alex Mercer's house, the sight of the perfectly compliant, board-approved heritage model mailbox sent a pleasant little shiver of accomplishment through her. It was a monument to order, a black metal flag planted firmly in the soil of her authority. She had even seen Alex retrieve his mail from it, his face as maddeningly placid as ever. But she knew, deep down, he had to know he'd been beaten. The natural order had been restored. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, the universe delivered its rebuttal. It arrived without fanfare, nestled between a Pottery Barn catalog and a pre-approved credit card offer. It was a plain, business-sized envelope, but the return address made Karen's breath catch in her throat. U.S. Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service, Austin, TX. Her first thought was that it was for Richard. He handled their personal finances, a task she found dreadfully boring. She placed it on the polished granite of the kitchen island where he'd see it, and proceeded to blend her morning kale and spinach smoothie. But a sliver of curiosity, sharp and insistent, burrowed into her mind. The letter was addressed not to Richard Sterling, but to Karen Sterling, President, or current resident. Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association? Her? It was for her, or rather, for her office. Her position? Her heart gave a little flutter of importance. The IRS was contacting the HOA. Perhaps they needed community data for a census, or were issuing a new tax-exempt guideline. She, as president, was the official point of contact. It was an affirmation of her status. Wiping her hands, she picked up her monogrammed silver letter opener and slit the envelope with surgical precision. The paper inside was thick, official, and covered in a dense, single-spaced font that seemed designed to induce anxiety. Reinitial. Contact letter, Compliance Check Organization, Maple Creek Estates, Homeowners Association, Neon, 38, XKSKCR Ms. Sterling. The Internal Revenue Service, Exempt Organizations EO Division, has selected your organization for a compliance check. This is not a formal audit, but a review to ensure your organization is adhering to the statutes and regulations governing its tax-exempt status under IRC, Section 501c4. Karen's brow furrowed. Compliance check. It sounded so routine, like the checks she performed on lawn height and fence stains. Obviously, their compliance was impeccable. She was in charge. After all, she read on. This review has been initiated based on information received by this office suggesting potential financial irregularities and governance issues that may affect your organization's tax-exempt status. These include, but are not limited to, potential prohibited, private benefit or inurement, insufficient record-keeping, and non-compliance with employment tax obligations. The word swam before her eyes. Irregularities, prohibited private benefit, inurement. They were ugly, bureaucratic words, but their meaning began to seep through her confidence like a dark stain. This wasn't a routine check. This was an accusation. To facilitate this review, please provide the following documents for the past three fiscal years within 30 calendar days of the date of this letter. A bulleted list followed. A litany of bureaucratic torture that seemed to stretch down the page for miles. Complete copies of all filed. Form 990s, detailed financial statements, including balance sheets, income statements, and a general ledger. Bank statements for all accounts held by the organization. Minutes from all board of directors and general membership meetings. A complete list of all vendors and contractors paid by the organization, along with copies of all contracts, invoices, and proofs of payment checks, wire transfers, etc. Documentation related to all employee and independent contractor classifications and payments, including any forms W-9 and 1099 issued. Karen sank onto one of her elegant Habactic kitchen stools. The smoothie sat forgotten in its splendor, its vibrant green mocking her suddenly gray world. The last bullet point hit her with the force of a physical blow. W-9, South and 1099s. Independent contractors. The handyman, Gus, the man she'd paid $100 in cash from the HOA's miscellaneous maintenance fund to rip Alex Mercer's mailbox out of the ground in the dead of night. There was no invoice. There was no W-9, there was no record other than a cryptic entry she'd made in her personal ledger. Community nuisance abatement, $200. Cold sweat broke out on her brow. This wasn't about a census, this was an investigation. And that phrase information received by this office, it could only mean one person, Alex Mercer. He hadn't confronted her, he hadn't yelled or threatened to sue. He had done something infinitely worse. He had sixed the full, terrifying power of the federal government on her. The quiet man with the sad eyes and the sentimental mailbox had just dropped a bomb on her perfectly ordered kingdom, and she was only now hearing the whistle of its descent. That evening, when Richard came home, she was waiting for him in the living room. The letter was laid out on the coffee table like a piece of evidence at a murder trial. Karen had been pacing for hours, the plush fibers of her cream-colored rug bearing witness to her mounting panic. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight. Richard, a portly man whose defining characteristic was a desire for peaceful evenings, loosened his tie. "Bad day, dear. The Abernathys leave their trash cans out again." "Worse, Richard, much worse." She pointed a trembling finger at the letter. "Read this." He picked it up, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He skimmed it, his expression changing from mild interest to mild confusion. "IRS looks like a lot of paperwork. Do you need me to help you make some copies at the office? Richard, did you read it? They're investigating us. They're talking about inurement and prohibited benefits. They think we're criminals." "Now, Karen, let's not be dramatic," he said, patting her shoulder in a way that was meant to be comforting but felt intensely patronizing. "It's just bureaucracy. They send these things out. You run this HOA by the book. More than by the book. You are the book. What could they possibly find? The handyman, Richard, for the mailbox," she whispered, as if the walls themselves were IRS agents. "I paid him in cash. There's no paper trail." Richard shrugged. "So it was $200. It's hardly the crime of the century. Just tell them it was a cash expense. It's no big deal. No big deal." Her voice rose to a near shriek. "They are threatening our tax-exempt status. This isn't about a fine for an unkempt lawn. This is the Internal Revenue Service. They can seize our assets. They can shut us down. This is all because of that man, Alex Mercer. He did this. He reported us." Richard sighed, the sound of a man retreating to his emotional bunker. "Well, I'm sure you'll handle it, dear. You always do. Is dinner ready?" The utter uselessness of her husband slammed into Karen with brutal clarity. She was alone. In this, the great orderly structure she had built was under attack from a silent, formidable enemy, and her second incumbent was wondering about pot roast. The next day, she called an emergency meeting of the Architectural Review Committee, which was effectively the entire HOA board. Carol and George arrived at her house looking nervous, having been summoned by a text message from Karen that said only, urgent, my house, 4 p.m., do not be late. She had them sit in her formal living room, a room so pristine it looked like no human had ever actually lived in it. She presented the letter with the gravity of a general revealing enemy battle plans. Carol read it, her face growing paler with every line. Oh my goodness, Karen, what does this mean? Are we in trouble? I don't want to go to jail. Nobody is going to jail. Carol, Karen snapped, though her own stomach was churning with the same fear. This is a procedural attack. It's a scare tactic, initiated by a disgruntled resident who couldn't bear to follow the same rules as everyone else. Mercer? George asked, finally catching on. The feds care about his mailbox. They don't care about the mailbox. George, Karen explained, trying to keep her voice even. He has framed our actions, our necessary and covenant-approved actions, as some sort of financial crime. He's twisted the truth. All we have to do is provide them with the records they've requested, and it will all be cleared up. It's an annoyance, nothing more. But Carol was fixated on the list. All these records, for 3 years. My goodness. Where are they? Karen forced a confident smile. Everything is perfectly organized. I'll just need to gather it all. Which brings me to the point of this meeting. I need a motion to formally approve the expense for the nuisance abatement at 142 Snapdragon Way. That was Alex's address. She was trying to retroactively bless the action, but we already approved it, didn't we? George asked. This is for the minutes. George, Karen said through gritted teeth, we need a clear, official record. We'll date it too before the removal. A motion to approve the expenditure of up to $250 for the removal of a non-compliant structure and installation of a board-approved replacement. Carol and George exchanged a confused look, but nodded. The motion was made, seconded, and passed, all under Karen's steely gaze. She was already rewriting history. Later that night, the real work began. The perfectly organized records of the Maple Creek HOA were stored in Karen's immaculate home office. The official documents, the covenant, the bylaws, plus the filed 990s from their sleepy accountant were in neat binders. The drive home from the construction site was a blur of silent, screaming panic. Karen gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel of her Lexus so tightly that her knuckles were as white as the car's paint. The handyman's mocking laughter echoed. In her ears, a soundtrack to her humiliation. You got your hand caught in the cookie jar, ain't ya? He had seen her not as the powerful president of Maple Creek Estates, but as a cornered animal, desperate and foolish. It was an intolerable image. She pulled into a pristine 2-car garage, the door gliding shut behind her, sealing her inside her sanctuary of order. But the order felt like a mockery now. It was a stage set, and behind the curtain, the machinery was on fire. For a fleeting moment, a terrifyingly sane thought pierced through her panic. I should call a lawyer. She imagined confessing the whole sordid mess of the mailbox, the cash payment, the failed attempt to create a false document to a stranger in a suit. She imagined him sighing, looking at her over a pair of expensive glasses, and telling her how much trouble she was in. The thought was unbearable. Calling a lawyer was an admission of guilt. It was ceding control. It was surrendering. And Karen Sterling did not surrender. She walked into her silent house. The cool, conditioned air, a stark contrast to the heat of her flushed skin, was at his golf club, a mercy she was grateful for. She didn't want to see his placid, useless face. She went straight to her home office, the command center of her little empire. The IRS letter lay on her desk, a white paper serpent. The 30-day deadline was now only 22 days away. Gus had refused to be her solution. Therefore, Gus had to disappear. Not the man himself, of course, just the record of him. The $200 problem. A new plan began to form, born not of logic but of sheer desperate will. She couldn't produce a real paper trail, so she would have to create a fictional one. She wouldn't be lying, she reasoned, her mind performing the breathtaking gymnastics of self-deception. She would be clarifying the records. The money was spent on community maintenance. The books simply needed to reflect that in a more compliant fashion. She was protecting the HOA, protecting her neighbors from the consequences of Alex Mercer's malicious crusade. She was the hero here, forced to do distasteful things to fight a hidden evil. That night, she waited until the house was dark and Richard's gentle snores were rumbling from the master bedroom. She crept back to her office and closed the door. With a glass of Chardonnay at her elbow, she sat down at her desk. The stage was set for her descent. She opened the large, leather-bound ledger. The entry was there, from 2 weeks ago. In her own elegant script, community nuisance, abatement, $200. It looked so incriminating now, so stark. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she took a bottle of high-quality correction, fluid the kind used for calligraphy, and carefully painted over the entry. She blew on it until it was dry, the chemical smell filling the otherwise sterile room. The $200 now needed a new home, a distributed, anonymous home. She booted up her computer and opened a folder labeled HOA templates. It contained her meticulously designed templates for violation notices, newsletters, and most importantly vendor invoices. Her first creation was an invoice for Suburban Garden Solutions. She invented the name on the spot. It sounded plausible, respectable. She gave it a fake address and phone number. The itemized service: emergency application of high-potency fertilizer and fungicide to common area petunia beds. The cost? $75. She printed it on high-quality ivory paper. Next, she created a receipt from a non-existent company called Clearwater Labs. Service: urgent chemical testing and balancing of community pond. Cost: $50. The final $75 was attributed to a cash-out receipt from Home Depot. She skillfully used a photo editing program to alter a scan of a real receipt she had, changing the date and items. Instead of potting soil, it now listed lumber, quickset concrete, exterior screws. These, she reasoned, could plausibly be for repairing a fence post or a bench, or perhaps a mailbox post. It was a subtle nod to the truth, a little inside joke that made her feel clever instead of criminal. She then went back to the ledger. In the place where the nuisance abatement entry had been, she now wrote 3 new, smaller entries, dated across several days. Her handwriting was as neat and controlled as ever. She tucked the freshly printed fake invoices and the altered Home Depot receipt into the Ferragamo shoebox with the other real ones. She took the scrap of paper with Gus's name and number on it, walked it to the kitchen, and held it over the gas stove until it curled into a black, weightless ash that she washed down the sink. It was done. Gus was gone. The $200 was now just harmless, routine maintenance. A wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over her. She had faced the abyss and papered it over with letterhead. She had restored order. A week later, for days to spare before the deadline, Karen stood at a FedEx counter. She had compiled everything into a large, professional-looking box. Every bank statement, every meeting minute, the ledger, and the shoebox of receipts, now salted with her forgeries. It was a masterpiece of compliance. Does this need to be there by a specific time? The clerk asked. As long as it arrives? By Friday, Karen said, a cool, confident smile on her face. It's just some routine paperwork for the government. She walked out of the store into the bright sunlight, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The ball was out of her court. She had done her part. She had met the challenge and triumphed through superior organization and cleverness. Let Alex Mercer watch from his window now. His little bomb had been diffused. The first 2 weeks after she sent the package were quiet. Karen began to relax, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, she resumed her patrols. Clipboard in hand, she wrote up Mrs. Gable for having unapproved seasonal decor, a tasteful autumn wreath with pine cones that were, in Karen's opinion, excessively large, and sent a stern email to the pool committee about suntan lotion residue on the lounge chairs. Life was returning to normal. The rumors, however, had begun to leak. Maple Creek was a closed ecosystem, and secrets were a nutrient that fed the gossip vines. Karen first encountered it at the neighborhood's organic market. She was inspecting avocados for blemishes when a voice cut through the air. Karen, I was hoping I'd see you. It was Brenda, a woman who lived 2 streets over. Brenda had a smile as wide as the Mississippi, and a reputation for knowing everything about everyone before they knew it themselves. Brenda. Hello, Karen said, forcing a pleasant tone. How are you? Oh, I'm fine. Just fine. But we've all been a little worried. Brenda lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, leaning closer over a display of heirloom tomatoes. There's a rumor going around. Something about the HOA and the IRS. Is everything okay? The question was posed as concern, but it felt like a surgical strike against Karen's authority. She could feel the eyes of the woman at the cheese counter on them. Karen produced a brittle laugh. Oh, that goodness. You know how people talk. It's nothing at all. Just a random compliance check. The government has to audit a certain percentage of nonprofits, and our number simply came up. It's all just paperwork. In fact, I've already sent everything in. It's a closed matter. She patted Brenda's arm. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. The HOA is in perfect financial health. Brenda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. Oh good. I'm so glad to hear it, because you know my brother. He's a tax attorney, and he says those random checks usually aren't random at all. He says they're almost always triggered by a complaint. The blood drained from Karen's face. She felt a sudden, desperate need for an escape route. Well, your brother-in-law sounds very smart, she said, grabbing the nearest avocado without even checking it. I have to run. Richard is expecting me. Lovely to see you, Brenda. She fled the market, her heart hammering against her ribs. Triggered by a complaint. Of course it was. Alex Mercer. Brenda knew, and if Brenda knew, the whole neighborhood knew. They were whispering behind her back, questioning her leadership, her competence. Her pristine reputation was being soiled by rumor and innuendo. The next day, the psychological pressure notched up another level. As she was pulling her Lexus into her driveway, she saw him. Alex Mercer was across the street, calmly watering a large bush of blue hydrangeas. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt his presence like a physical weight. He moved with a slow, deliberate calm that she now recognized as the most dangerous thing in the world. As she got out of her car, he turned off his hose, and his eyes met hers from across the perfectly manicured lawns. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he simply looked at her, and in that placid, unreadable gaze, Karen's guilty conscience projected everything she feared. He knew about the handyman, he knew about the IRS, and she was suddenly, chillingly certain that he knew about the fake receipts. He had set a trap, and he was now simply watching her struggle in it. She broke eye contact first, scurrying into her house like a frightened mouse. 1 week later, 29 days after she had mailed the package, the phone rang. It was 3:15 p.m. on a Wednesday. She was in the kitchen, arranging celery sticks and carrot batons on a platter for Richard's pre-diner snack. It was an unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. The world narrowed to the black plastic of the phone in Karen's hand, and the calm, merciless voice traveling through it. Agent Miller's question, "Could you please provide a different contact number?" was not a question, it was a conviction. A polite, bureaucratic death sentence. Time seemed to warp. In the space of a heartbeat, Karen saw her future spool out before her. More phone calls. Lawyers with grim faces. Depositions. The whispers of her neighbors turning into open scorn. She saw her face in the local paper. The perfect coif of her hair looking ridiculous above a headline containing the words fraud and embezzlement. She saw the stone entrance of Maple Creek Estates, not as the gateway to her kingdom, but as the monument to her ruin. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. She had to get off the phone. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, injecting a note of flustered, matronly helplessness into her voice. "You know, my husband just walked in the door with an armful of groceries, and one of the bags just split. There are oranges rolling everywhere. What a disaster." She let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I am so sorry, I don't have those files right here in the kitchen. Can I be terribly rude and call you back? Let me just grab a pen." There was another one of those devastating pauses from Agent Miller's end. Karen could almost feel him, considering her ridiculous, transparent lie. "Of course, Ms. Sterling," he said, his tone unchanged. "Take your time. My direct number is 202-555-0182. I will await your call. Thank you, you're a lifesaver." She chirped, and hung up before he could say another word. The moment the call disconnected, the facade dissolved. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the travertine floor. The half-snapped carrot stick fell from her other hand. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gulps. The carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbled into dust, and a tidal wave of pure, undiluted terror crashed over her. She stumbled away from the kitchen island, her hand pressed to her chest as if to physically keep her heart from exploding. "No, no, no, no," she chanted under her breath, pacing the length of her cavernous kitchen. The oranges. Her lie was so stupid, so cliché. He knew. Of course, he knew. He was an IRS agent. He probably heard 100 stupid lies a day. He was playing with her, a cat with a terrified mouse. Her pacing grew more frantic. She bumped into one of the high-backed stools, sending it scraping across the floor with a hideous screech. The sound jolted her, and the terror morphed into a white-hot rage. This was not her fault, this was his fault. Alex Mercer. He had pushed her to this. He had sat there, quiet and judgmental, with his ugly, non-compliant mailbox, forcing her hand at every turn. He had set this fire, and now he was watching her burn from the safety of his porch. The injustice of it all was a physical sickness in her stomach. She had to do something. The lie about the oranges had bought her minutes. She needed to buy herself months, years. She needed a new strategy, something more robust than fake receipts. Her first plan had been to hide the crime. Her new plan would be to annihilate the accuser. If she couldn't prove her own innocence, she would have to prove his guilt of being a malicious, untrustworthy, vindictive liar whose complaints should be dismissed as the ravings of a neighborhood crank. But she couldn't do it alone. A lone voice of accusation could be dismissed, but the concerned board of directors that had weight, she needed to spread the blame, to make Carol and George unwitting accomplices in her new fiction. She needed to entangle them so tightly in her narrative that they couldn't back out without incriminating themselves. She snatched her phone from the floor and sent another imperious text message. "Emergency board meeting, my house, 1 hour. This is not a request." Carol arrived first, her face already pale with anxiety. George shuffled in a few minutes later, looking as if he'd been woken from a nap. Karen led them not to the formal living room, but to her office, the scene of her original crime. She wanted them surrounded by the official evidence of the HOA. "The IRS called," she announced, foregoing any preamble. Her voice was brittle, sharp. "They are questioning our records." Carol gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What did you tell them? Did you tell them about the Knoll?" "Of course not, Carol," Karen snapped. "I told them nothing, but this is worse than I thought. They are nitpicking. They are twisting our normal, everyday expenses into something sinister. This is a witch hunt," and Alex Mercer lit the torch. She began to pace, weaving her new narrative with the passion of a seasoned stage actor. "They asked about some of our landscaping expenses. They are trying to claim that our records are sloppy. It's a classic intimidation tactic. They are trying to find a technicality to punish us for enforcing our own covenant against Mr. Mercer. George blinked. But our records are good, right? You keep everything in that shoebox. The records are fine, George, Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension, but they are being deliberately misinterpreted by a federal agency that has been weaponized by a disgruntled resident. Don't you see? This is his new way of fighting the mailbox violation. He couldn't win on the facts, so he's trying to destroy the HOA itself. Carol was wringing her hands. What do we do? Karen, should we hire a lawyer? No. The word shot out of Karen, sharp and final. A lawyer is the first thing guilty people do. It sends the wrong signal. We have done nothing wrong. We must not act like we have. We need to be proactive. We need to control the narrative. She stopped pacing and fixed them both with a look of grim determination. We need to show the IRS who their source really is. We need to document every issue we have ever had with Alex Mercer, every late payment on his dues, every time his lawn was a quarter-inch too high, every passive-aggressive comment. We need to build a file that proves he is not a concerned citizen, but a serial troublemaker with a vendetta against this board. A flicker of something perhaps common sense crossed Carol's face. But we don't have a file like that. He always pays his dues on time. His lawn is perfect. We will create the file, Carol, Karen said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hush. We will reconstruct it from memory. For the good of the community. We can draft a series of violation warnings for things we know he did, but perhaps were too neighborly to document at the time. We can write a formal summary of his hostile attitude at our meetings. We will build a portrait of a problem resident. It's not a lie, it's a more complete truth. George looked utterly bewildered. So, we're going to give the IRS a file of fake violations we never sent him. Karen's eye twitched. It's not fake, George. It's a retroactive formalization of informal observations. We are presenting our case. Do you understand? We must show a united front. When I call Agent Miller back, I will inform him that the board is preparing a file on the complainant to demonstrate his lack of credibility. I need to know you both support this action. She stared them down, her will a palpable force in the small room. Carol looked like she was about to be physically ill, but she nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. George, lost in the verbal fog, just shrugged. If you say so, Karen, you're the president. It was all the assent Karen needed. She had her mandate. That night, after her two board members had scurried away, Karen set to work once more. This time, she wasn't forging receipts. She was forging a man's history. She created a new folder on her computer, Mercer, a compliance file. She designed a new form, official HOA warning notice, and began to populate it. Warning number 1, dated 6 months prior. Violation, unapproved, mailbox art, IV, Sec. 8B. Note, resident became argumentative upon informal notification. Warning number 2, dated 4 months prior. Violation, improper landscape lighting art. VI Sec. 2A. Fixtures emit a cool white light, instead of the approved warm white. Warning number 3, dated 2 months prior. Violation, aggressive and disruptive behavior. Community, bylaws. Sec. 2A Blas. Resident approached HOA president in a hostile manner regarding petunia maintenance. She invented dates, times, and quotes. She wrote a 2-page summary of Mercer's pattern of antisocial behavior. It was a work of pure fiction, a character assassination on paper. As she printed each page, she felt the same perverse thrill she'd felt when forging the receipts, the thrill of imposing her own reality on the world, of bending facts to suit her narrative. She was no longer just a defendant. She was a prosecutor, building a case against her own accuser. The next morning, armed with her new strategy and a file folder full of lies, she took a deep breath and dialed the number for Agent Miller. Her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest, but her voice, when she spoke, was pure steel. Agent Miller, Karen Sterling calling you back. I do apologize for the chaos yesterday. Not a problem, Ms. Sterling, his voice replied, as impassive as ever. Were you able to locate the information on Suburban Garden Solutions? This was the moment. She took the plunge. Actually, Agent Miller, that's part of a larger issue I feel it's my duty to bring to your attention, she said, her tone grave and serious. I've reviewed the ledger. It seems our previous treasurer, a man who has since moved to Florida, was unfortunately quite disorganized in his record-keeping. I and the board have been working diligently to clean up the mess he left. The entry you mentioned was likely my attempt to reconstruct one of his poorly documented cash expenditures. She let that lie settle. The words field agent echoed in the funereal silence of Karen's office. They were no longer abstract threats from a distant bureaucracy. They were footsteps. They were a knock on the door. They were an invasion. Karen's first instinctual act was to cover her tracks. The file folder on her desk, Mercer, a compliance file, which just hours before had been her magistroke, was now a book of evidence detailing her own felonies. The fake invoices, so cleverly crafted, were poison pills in her shoebox of records. A voice on the phone could be lied to. A person in her living room, a professional trained to spot deception, could ask to see the very documents she had just described. That night, the home office became a scene of frantic destruction. With the grim efficiency of a spy burning their identity, Karen fed every forged document into her high-end cross-cut shredder. The fake violation notices against Alex, the fictional invoices from Suburban Garden Solutions and Clearwater Labs, the altered Home Depot recital were reduced to a confetti of lies that filled her wastebasket. It was a deeply unsatisfying act. The relief she expected didn't come. Instead, she felt a profound sense of self-inflicted defeat. She was destroying the weapons from a battle she had already lost. This wasn't strategy, it was just cleaning up the blood. The next morning she summoned Carol and George for a third emergency meeting. Her tone had changed. The imperious command was gone, replaced by a brittle, high-strung urgency. They met in her living room, the room she'd mentally designated for the coming interrogation. When she told them a field agent was coming to Maple Creek, Carol let out a small, strangled squeak and collapsed into a brocade armchair as if her bones had dissolved. A field agent, Carol whispered, her face the color of chalk. Here, to talk to us. I want to see the original documents, Karen said, forcing a calm she did not feel. And they want to interview residents. George, for once, seemed to grasp the gravity. But, the file on Mercer? The one you had us vote on? You just made it up yesterday. What do we tell them? This was the moment Karen had dreaded. She couldn't admit she'd already destroyed the file. She needed them to stick to the story, even if the evidence for it was gone. We tell them the truth we agreed upon, Karen said, her gaze darting between them. That Mercer is a problem, and the records were a mess when I took over. But we must be careful, we must be consistent. They will try to divide us. But Carol was shaking her head, tears welling in her eyes. I can't, Karen, I can't do it. Lie to a federal agent. In person. My husband has a heart condition. The stress will kill him. I'll kill him. She was becoming hysterical. I'm going to tell them everything. That you paid the handyman in cash? That you made us vote on things after they happened? That the Mercer file was your idea. It's better than going to jail. The betrayal was so swift, so absolute, it stole breath. Her most pliable, loyal follower had broken. Carol, you will do no such thing, Karen commanded, but her authority was gone. She was a queen without an army. I have to, Carol sobbed. It's the right thing to do. We should have done it weeks ago. Before Karen could respond, the doorbell chimed. Its gentle, melodic tone sounded like a death knell. All three of them froze. Through the beveled glass of the front door, Karen could see the silhouette of a woman standing on her porch with leaden feet. Karen walked to the door and opened it. The woman standing there was not what she'd expected. She was young, perhaps, in her early 30s, with dark, intelligent eyes and a calm, professional demeanor. She wore a simple navy blue pantsuit and her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She looked more like a business school professor than a government enforcer. Karen Sterling, the woman asked, her voice pleasant but firm. Yes, Karen managed. The woman held up a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge and an identification card. My name is Agent Isabella Rossi, Internal Revenue Service. As Agent Miller informed you, I'm here to continue the compliance review of the Maple Creek HOA. The siege had begun. Karen led Agent Rossi into the living room, where Carol was still weeping quietly, and George looked like he wished the floor would swallow him. Rossi's eyes took in the scene with a quick analytical glance that missed nothing. Perhaps it would be best if I spoke with you first. Ms. Sterling, Rossi said, her tone suggesting it wasn't a question. Alone. After ushering a relieved George and a still sobbing Carol out the door with a hissed promise to call them later, Karen sat opposite the agent. The living room, her showcase of taste and control, felt like an interrogation cell. Agent Rossi opened a sleek leather portfolio. Ms. Sterling, in your call with Agent Miller, you mentioned that your previous treasurer had left the HOA's records in a disorganized state. Could you provide me with his name and last known address? The first lie? Karen was ready for it. His name was Arthur Vance. He was elderly. He moved to a retirement community in Florida, I believe, Naples. I don't have his address. I see, Rossi said, making a note. And you also mentioned a file you were compiling on a resident, a Mr. Alex Mercer, detailing his history of conflicts with the HOA. May I see that file, please? I can't, Karen stammered. In the interest of full transparency, after my call with Agent Miller, I consulted the HOA's document retention policy. As the complaints were informal and had been resolved, the policy dictated they be destroyed to protect the residents' privacy. I was simply following procedure. Agent, Rossi looked up from her notes, her placid expression unwavering. You destroyed a file relevant to an active federal investigation less than 24 hours after telling a federal agent you were preparing it for him. I was following our bylaws, Karen repeated, her own voice sounding thin and unconvincing. Agent, Rossi made another note. Could I see a copy of that document retention policy, please? Checkmate. There was no such policy. Karen's mind raced. a frantic search for another lie to patch the hole in the first one. It was a verbal policy, instituted by Mr. Vance. For the next hour, Agent Rossi dismantled Karen's reality, piece by painstaking piece, with calm, simple questions that exposed the rickety scaffolding of her lies. Each answer Karen gave only dug her hole deeper. When the interview was finally over, Agent Rossi stood up. "Thank you for your time, Miss Sterling. I have a few more people to speak with in the neighborhood. I will be in touch if I have any further questions." Karen watched from her window as Agent Rossi's black sedan pulled away from her curb and drove 2 streets over, parking directly in front of Carol's house. Karen's stomach twisted. She knew what was happening. Carol, terrified and unburdened by Karen's intimidating presence, would be singing like a canary. The rest of the day was a living nightmare. Karen could feel the vibration of the neighborhood gossip network. Brenda was probably on a one-woman phone campaign. The sight of the government car was an undeniable spectacle. Neighbors who usually waved now seemed to hurry inside their homes. As she drove past, she was an outcast in her own kingdom. By late afternoon, her rage and terror had curdled into a single, desperate impulse. She had to face him. She had to face the man who had started it all. She stormed out of her house, marching across her perfect lawn and down the sidewalk with a speed and purpose that scattered a flock of sparrows. She didn't stop until she was standing on the front porch of 142 Snapdragon Way, the home of Alex Mercer. She hammered on his door with her fist, the polite chime of the doorbell insufficient for her fury. He opened the door a moment later. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and held a book in one hand, a finger marking his page. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked weary. "You," she hissed, her voice trembling with venom. "You did this. You couldn't stand that you had to follow the same rules as everyone else, so you decided to burn everything to the ground. You've ruined everything." Alex Mercer looked at her, his calm gaze finally showing a flicker of emotion. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to pity. "No, Karen," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "You did this. I was protecting our property values. I was maintaining order," she shrieked. "You were being a bully," he replied, his voice still level. "This was never about my mailbox. I would have replaced it if you had just spoken to me like a human being. But you find me, you sent threatening letters, and then you sent a man in the middle of the night to destroy my property my late wife designed for me. You used the HOAS money, our neighbor's money, to settle a petty, personal score." He took a step forward, not menacingly, but with the force of his conviction. "You broke the rules first, Karen, not the HOAS rules. The bigger ones. And then you lied. You created false documents. You tried to frame me to a federal agent. The only person who ruined you is the one you see in the mirror every morning." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. There was no defense. He knew it all. He had seen it all. Defeated, she stumbled back from his porch, the rage draining out of her, leaving only a hollow, echoing despair. She walked back to her house in a daze. Her perfect home felt alien, a museum of a life that was already over. Richard was home. He was standing in the foyer, his face pale. He had clearly seen Agent Rossi's car, had likely heard the news from the neighborhood. Grapevine, the blissful ignorance was gone. "Karen," he started, his voice shaky. The lawyer's words hung in the air of the pristine foyer, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Criminal investigation, wire fraud, obstruction, conspiracy. They were the words from the television shows Richard watched. Abstract concepts for other, lesser people. Now they were here, in this house, attached to their names. Richard, who had stood frozen during the lawyer's pronouncement, finally moved. He turned to Karen, and for the first time in their 25 years of marriage, she saw something other than placid indifference in his eyes. She saw pure, undiluted hatred. "You," he whispered, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of their quiet life. "You did this. With your rules, your clipboards, your goddamned mailbox." "Richard, I was trying to protect us," Karen began, the words sounding feeble even to her own ears. "I was maintaining standards." "Standards." He laughed, a bitter, barking sound that held no humor. "You were on a power trip, Karen. A pathetic little tyrant in a kingdom of beige houses. I let you have it because it kept you busy. It kept you from bothering me. I went to the club. You counted petunias, and we called it a marriage." He advanced on her, his face flushed, his entire body trembling with a rage she never knew he possessed. "But this, the IRS, federal agents looking at my business, at my accounts? Did you ever once stop to think that your little HOA war could burn down everything I've built?" I didn't know who he was," she stammered, shrinking back against the wall. "You didn't care. You just saw someone who wouldn't bow down, and you couldn't stand it." He gestured wildly around the perfect house. "This is all going away, you know. The lawyers," Croft said, "we need a retainer of $200,000. To start, where do you think that comes from, Karen? It comes from this house. It comes from our retirement. It comes from everything you and your obsession have just incinerated." He stopped, standing over her, his chest heaving. The final killing blow was delivered not in a shout, but in a defeated, hollow whisper. "I should have left you 10 years ago." He turned and walked away, not to his study, but straight out the front door, leaving it hanging open. Karen was left sitting on the floor in a house that no longer felt like hers, utterly and finally alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of humiliating practicalities. The for sale sign hammered into their perfect lawn was the neighborhood's ultimate victory monument. Michael Croft, their lawyer, was a grim and expensive realist. He laid out the government's case in his mahogany-paneled office. They had Carol's tearful, detailed confession. They had George's confused but damning corroboration. They had the bank records showing the cash withdrawal. They had Agent Rossi's report detailing Karen's lies about the non-existent treasurer and the file she'd claimed to have and then conveniently destroyed. They have you, Karen Croft said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Going to trial is professional suicide. The AUSA will paint you as an arrogant, vindictive fraud who bullied her neighbors and lied to federal agents. No jury will sympathize with you. The only path forward was a plea deal. Richard, through his own lawyer, had already agreed to plead guilty to a misdemeanor tax charge for willful blindness and failure to properly oversee the HOA's finances, which he had technically been obligated to do as a board member on paper. He would pay a hefty fine and receive 2 years of probation. He had sold her out to save himself. Karen's deal was far harsher. She would plead guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States and 1 count of obstruction of justice. In exchange, the government would drop the other, more numerous charges. The sentencing would be left to the judge. But the prosecutor would recommend a term at the lower end of the federal guidelines. The day of the sentencing felt like a dream. Karen stood before a stern-faced female judge in a cavernous, wood-paneled courtroom. She wore a simple black dress, a stark contrast to her usual vibrant power outfits. She saw a few of her old neighbors in the gallery. Brenda was there, her expression one of grim satisfaction. She did not see Alex Mercer. When the judge asked for her plea, Karen's voice was a dry rasp. Guilty, Your Honor. The word felt like swallowing poison. It was the antithesis of her entire existence. Before passing sentence, the judge looked down at her from the bench, her eyes missing nothing. Ms. Sterling, this court has reviewed the particulars of your case. You were not stealing to feed a family. You were not in the grip of a desperate addiction. Your crime seems to be born of something far more insidious: arrogance. You were entrusted with a position of minor authority, and you wielded it like a cudgel. You believed the rules were for everyone but you. You used community funds as your own personal war chest to harass a man over a mailbox. When you were caught, you lied, you fabricated, and you conspired, digging your hole deeper at every turn. You have shown a breathtaking contempt for the law, for your neighbors, and for the truth. The judge paused, letting the silence hang in the air. This country is built on rules. Ms. Sterling, from the federal tax code down to the bylaws of the smallest homeowners association, they are the architecture of a civil society. Your sentence today is not just punishment for your crimes, but a message that no one is above that architecture. Karen Sterling was sentenced to 18 months in a federal minimum security correctional facility for women. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the Maple Creek HOA for all legal fees incurred, and a fine of $100,000. As the marshals led her from the courtroom, her last glimpse was of Richard, sitting alone, looking not at her, but at the floor, a man already erased from her life. 6 months later, life in Maple Creek Estates had found a new, quieter equilibrium. The Sterling house had been sold to a young family with 3 boisterous children who left tricycles on the lawn. Carol had resigned from the board in shame, and George had been politely removed during a special election. A new, more reasonable board was in place. Alex Mercer had taken down the ugly, black heritage mailbox that had been the catalyst for the whole affair. In its place, he had commissioned a local artist to build a new one, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship made from copper and reclaimed wood, with a small, elegant scrollwork of a blooming hydrangea, his late wife's favorite flower. The new board had unanimously approved it without comment. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Alex was raking leaves, the mail carrier handed him his stack of mail. Tucked between a magazine and a utility bill was a plain white envelope. There was no return address. The postmark was from Alderson, West Virginia. He went inside and sat down in his quiet office. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cheap, lined paper, torn from a notepad. On it, in a familiar, elegant, but now slightly shakier script, were 4 words: I understand now. K.S. Alex stared at the note for a long time. The ambiguity of it settled deep in his bones. Did she understand remorse? Did she understand, finally, the pain and humiliation she had caused? The simple human decency she had lacked? Had 18 months of rules she couldn't bend and power she couldn't wield finally broken through her armor of self-righteousness? Or did she understand something else entirely? Did she understand, in the cold, hard calculus of a prison yard, the true nature of power? That her mistake wasn't in being a tyrant, but in being a petty one? That she had chosen the wrong battlefield, the wrong weapons, against the wrong opponent? Did she now understand that to truly control your world, you needed not a clipboard and a list of rules, but a deep, ruthless knowledge of the system, and a willingness to use it with devastating precision. He looked out the window at his new mailbox, a quiet monument to a war he had never wanted to fight but had been forced to win. He thought of Karen, sitting in a cell. Her world shrunk from a sprawling, manicured estate to a 6 by 9 foot room. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into the book on his desk. He didn't know what Karen Sterling finally understood, and that, he realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, was the most unsettling mystery of all. The fire had been put out, but he was left to wonder about the nature of the embers, glowing quietly in the dark.